Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Fulco, Agnita M. Stine Curator at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. It's my great pleasure to welcome you back to a new edition of the Curator's Den, a program in which I explore different aspects of the museum's collection and offer some of my insights about them. Today, what I'm going to do is delve further into the Kerstein Gallery installation. And some of you may remember this from my previous edition. Today, we're going to be looking at another group of works from this installation that was completed back in October. Before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsor, Mrs. Durwood B. Bowsam. The name of the Kerstein Gallery display is called the 8th Abstraction, Modernism and Innovation. Today, we're going to go back to where I left off last time and pick up with the beginnings of abstraction and see how modernism took on different shapes and forms during the mid-20th century. So the earliest we'll be reaching back to today is about the 1920s. Here are just a couple of shots before launching into discussion of specific works that shows you how the installation looks. If you do come to the museum, I strongly encourage you to view the works of art that are on display. It really came out very nice. While there was a preceding installation that went until about 2020, fall of 2021, originally installed in 2016. This time we have refreshed it and offered you a deeper look at some of the works from this modernist period that are in the collection. So without further ado, we will launch into the discussion. We begin today with an artist who's not a household name to many people. His name was Hamilton Akiel Wolff. When I was picking works for the installation, I was quite intrigued by his painting. I'm shown there on the upper left, and it's called Annunciation. It's from probably the mid-1930s to early 1940s. Wolff was the son of a printmaker, a guy named Henry Wolff, who was one of the premier wood engravers of portraits during the late 1800s. However, Hamilton took a very different path in terms of his artistic interests. And while he was a figurative artist, he started to push the boundaries of his style, his technique in different directions. And as you'll note in this painting on the upper left, which is quite different from the example that was at auction some years back called The Afternoon at the Market, which looks at the condition of everyday Americans, something that we call social realist, at least in style. That is, that it's looking at the condition of people and their surroundings and how they cope with these issues in everyday life, and which in some ways is based off of the realist impulses and motivations of artists we looked at last time, particularly Robert Henry and the group known as the Eight or the Ashcan group or school. But what Wolff does as time goes on, once he gets into what is likely a painting from the 40s, he begins to explore new directions. You'll notice that there's a beam of light in this painting that shines behind the woman, comes from the right, and then it just goes down to the left there, creating these really interesting highlights. It's as if something has spontaneously appeared to have caught her attention. She turns her body in reaction and glances off to the right. But look at what he's done here with the rays of light. They almost seem to break up the pictorial space. They almost seem like geometric forms, that is, a geometrified. And look at how angular also the corners of the room are, even the chair, and the almost mask-like qualities of her eyes, as well as her body. He begins to play around with abstraction and introduce it into what's really a figurative painting. The title of the work is derived from the age-old Christian religious art, going back to the Middle Ages and even before that. But the exact nature of what the painting might mean is left up to us to interpret. And at least in my view, it seems that this lady may be experiencing a spiritual moment or revelation, not necessarily that it has a religious connotation, more personally spiritual, perhaps. His partial fragmentation of that pictorial plane forms these dynamic rectangles, contrasting with the woman's rounded bodily forms and accentuating the canvases and the composition's overall energy and movement. And this, in my view, reflects the influence of Cubism and Futurism, which were two very important movements of abstract art originating with artists like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque in the early 20th century. You will also notice that to some degree, in terms of breaking down the pictorial plane and the thicker application of paint to the surface of the canvas, has parallels with another work that's on view in the gallery by Sarah Stafford Goodwin, and that I featured in one of my weekend art emails if you received those and followed. A painting entitled Farm Scene Study for a Mural Post Office, possibly, in Langland, Delaware, which is near Newcastle. What she's doing here is she's celebrating American agriculture in Delaware, and specifically dairy farming, the poultry industry, also the gathering of firewood that you see here with this man who's holding wood in his arms. But you can also see farmers in the background and then these swans and birds that are flying around here. It's meant to celebrate the values of American life at the time. During the 1930s, there were a great many civic mural commissions as part of the Works Progress Administration, set up by Franklin Delano Roosevelt with his New Deal and subsequent social programs. So what I've looked to do in this installation, as I mentioned last time, is to draw parallels between artists who are not necessarily directly connected, but who are trying to achieve similar aesthetic goals, or at least the building up of their compositions, their artistic and stylistic outlooks, as the visual arts really changed during the early to mid 20th century and continuing to do so beyond that. A Baltimore artist by the name of Charles Hugo Walther is shown here on the left. Oh, and before I move on, just one thing. Hamilton Akiel Wolf originally came from back east. He studied in New York, but he would relocate to California, and he would end up teaching at the School of Art in Oakland, California. So he was a West Coast artist, even though he was born on the East Coast. Just wanted to add that in there. We will be seeing some other artists who come from the other side of the country. Meanwhile, Walther, closer to home in Baltimore, is quite different. Creating a series of imaginative forms, he juxtaposes them with one another in the canvas on the left. A recent gift of Mike and Enos Merson, in honor of their grandson, Laszlo Haggard, as you can see there on the left. This is really an outstanding work. It's one of the finest in the collection. And it's really very colorful, bold, and dynamic. It almost looks as if a lizard is soaring up into the sky. These almost look like skyscrapers down here. And that this creature, if it is a lizard, is being illuminated by a beam of light coming through what appears to be water and the archway of a bridge. So it's as if he's taken different locations in space and merged them together into this composition, as if the water were fantastically above us, above the events, the circumstances, situation of everyday life down below. And it looks like it's being projected upward into space. It's very imaginative. It almost has a surreal quality to it, a machine age one, perhaps even Art Deco. And these geometric and curvilinear forms that you see in the composition are really nicely complemented by these Pac-Man type moons that are in the upper left and right corners and also down below of the frame crafted by Daniel Inglet, a Baltimore frame maker. So a really interesting painting. And Walther, for many years, was involved with the Maryland Institute College of Art in the city. However, he would break away from it at a certain point in his career because he disagreed with the methods of instruction and also the style of art that was being taught there. He was more interested, like Wolf, in Cubism and Futurism. And these movements became very important to him. He had been very much affected by those trends going on over in Europe. And also, no doubt, the 1913 Armory show that was held in New York City. So, as you can see, this painting is in some ways much bolder than the one here that's also in our collection called Untitled Abstract number 121. This one was slightly earlier from 1915. So he starts to amplify and energize this aesthetic impulse more in Abstract from 1924 on the left than in the one on the center here, which has this almost playful, bouncy kind of quality to it. It almost looks like there's a figure emerging here on the right-hand side, juxtaposed against the sky, or perhaps the exterior of a building. We can make out the outlines of some kind of mountains and also a house or a tower. So Walt is a very whimsical artist, and he plays around with these geometric forms in a way similar to the work of Seattle artist Nikolai Kuvshinov, who was actually born in Russia but emigrated to the United States. Walter, like Kuvshinov, was influenced by French modernism and the works of Picasso and Braque and others. And Kuvshinov was too. In fact, some of his still lifes do bear a resemblance to those artists that I just mentioned. But for him, he's more interested in Cubism. And in La Nature Morte, or Still Life, most of the elements of the composition meld together through color and interlocking geometric shapes. But you will notice several recognizable elements, particularly the clearly defined and readily depicted vase that we see here. Perhaps these are some instruments or other objects that are laid out on the table, but they are really, the colors here make the center of the composition much bolder and more apparent, contrasted with the browns and blacks in the background. While he was not involved with teaching in any particular art school, Kuvshinov was an important part of the Seattle artistic community, and he sketched fashion advertisements for Bon Marche magazine, and he produced cartoons for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. He did service in World War II and was stationed in Asia, where he earned 2 Bronze Stars. He also painted murals for Seattle nightclubs and military officers' clubs. And like his wife, she was also an artist, they both lived in Cascade, nearby to the city. This one shows you kind of how he, as time went on, his work moved in a somewhat of a, different direction depending on which composition it was. Ours, the work is kind of more loosely executed in style. The brushstrokes aren't quite as tight. It's not quite as a precise composition as the one shown here on the right, called Nature Morte 746. And in this one, I think you can see the resemblance to Pablo Picasso much more, particularly with what looks like a piece of meat assembled with other food stuffs on the table with a glass of water. This one being much more indebted to the French master. But interesting to show how they bear a resemblance to one another. An artist very different as we shift gears from people working in America. We go for just a moment over to Europe. And that's one of the things I also wanted to demonstrate in this, is that the museum also has important works that engage with European modernism, such as the little known but very talented sculptor Dusan Penic, a Croatian modernist, in his piece, The Muse of Memory, done in 1919. And I've paired it here and in the gallery with René Lalique's Chamois vase from 1931, because both artists seem to be responding to the French Art Deco style, which merged forms deriving from both ancient and medieval art of the Western tradition, but reinterpreted them in contemporary, then contemporary idiom. And by that I mean that you start to see a breakdown of pictorial space. You see the use of geometric forms, and also the fascination with the interlocking and the curving of these shapes in space, and in this case in 3D, and also showing the dynamism and the energy of how they merge with one another and in their interplay. Referring to the muses of classical mythology and allegory in this title for this sculpture on the left, which is about this big, it's not very large. we see a reflective woman who supports her head and her long flowing hair with her hand. While the gesture that she has connotes both sadness and solitude, it also shows how she is lost in thought. And the curving pose bears a resemblance to another work that he did, sort of in some regard like a medieval depiction of Christ, particularly a crucifixion, in a muse from the 1910s, which was formerly on the auction. Here you can see the Muse of Memory, the plaster cast that was originally exhibited at the Kerstein Gallery in New York, and that was illustrated in Vanity Fair magazine in April 1919. So the plaster study would have come first, and then we have the bronze. Some have argued that the sculpture in our museum's collection is a small-scale version for a proposed garden fountain project. However, it remains uncertain whether Peniche actually completed the final full-size commission. At the time, the artist also produced several bronze casts of the same subject, one of which we have. Peniche was an important part of Croatian modernism, and he was based in Zagreb, which is today Croatia, but back then was Yugoslavia. We move from Peniche and also a brief mention there, René Lalique, to Lillian Orlov, a very interesting woman artist. The Kerstein Gallery installation also tries to bring to light stories of lesser known artists and underrepresented artists, such as these very fantastic and talented women painters, and in this case, Orlov, who was also the daughter of Russian immigrants and who operated a grocery store in Buffalo, New York. Later, she would relocate to Cleveland, Ohio, where she earned a law degree and worked as an assistant police prosecutor. However, that didn't really interest her. What she wanted to do was she wanted to create art, so she abandoned her legal profession to do so. She returned to America from an important study trip in Europe and enrolled at the Art Students League in New York City in the early 1900s, taking classes with people like Kenneth Hayes Miller, William Zorak, who was a sculptor, Thomas Hart Benton, a very important artist in the 1930s, and particularly in the regionalist or social realist style, and also European modernists who also immigrated to America, George Grosz from Germany. But very significantly, her time at the Art Student League facilitated her introduction to a group of artists who became known as the Indian Space Painters. This was a group that originated at the school, that is the Arts League in New York City, and it consisted of artists such as Steve Wheeler, Peter Busa, Robert Burrell, and the famous American printmaker Will Barnett. So Orlov was very much captivated by the work that these artists did. The Indian Space Painters, as they're known, would eventually move down to Arizona and New Mexico in that area and work there nearby to Santa Fe and also Taos. But this composition that we have on the left, it's a rather large painting, actually, quite bold in terms of its color. Just has the title composition number 2. She leaves it open to us in terms of what's going on here. We see what looks like a figure staring at some kind of a lion-type creature. It has a snout as well as whiskers. Like some of the other artists, particularly Charles Walther, she has a sense of humor and whimsy about her in terms of how she creates this painting. It responds to the art of surrealism that was emerging at this time, and we will look at another surrealist artist who's displayed near her in a moment, but it also shows the influence of Pablo Picasso's Cubism. I'm very much fascinated by this painting and by this artist, about whom and of which her work is not very well represented. So when I found it in storage, I said, we've got to get it upstairs and get it on view in order to tell more stories of European modernism and its different iterations. The forceful colors she uses, particularly the red and the green, converge to establish a bold, arresting composition. And you can see here that there's almost the sense of conversation and also motion that's going on in this painting that almost has sculptural qualities to it. You'll note that it bears some resemblance to a work by her that's in the Akron Art Museum. However, The one that we have, I think, is a bit more dynamic in terms of the juxtaposition of the different forms and the colors across the pictorial plane. It also has a bit more of mystery to it. This one shows the heavy influence of Pablo Picasso, not unlike what we saw with the other Kuvishinov on the previous slide. What looks like a fish here that merges with a human head and also the eyes of a woman who's looking out directly at us. This is called The Age of Fish. It is rather humorous, and we can see the scales of the fish right here. Probably from the same time period, this one, and it's been in the collection of the Akron Museum since 1947, whereas ours came into our possession in 1958. That was 1 year, actually, after she passed away. Unfortunately, Lillian Orlov's life was cut way too short. Also influenced and connected to surrealism in some ways is an artist named Kurt Seligman. And Seligman was born in Switzerland, but he emigrated to the US, first studying at the School of Fine Arts in Geneva from 1918 to 19. Later, he would move to Paris, where he joined his friend and the renowned sculptor, Alberto Giacometti, whose work is the subject now of a solo exhibition at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And Giacometti would introduce Seligman to Hans Arp and Jean Hélion, who were two key surrealists. And surrealism is very important because it was among the first art forms to explore different aspects of the human subconscious. And by that, I mean dreams and the world that we envision during our sleep. That is, for the artists, what they would sometimes do, artists like Salvador Dali, is he would deliberately put himself into a state of being in which he was halfway between sleeping and being awake. And he would try to make himself create a painting on a canvas. And this was something known as automatist painting, in which he allowed the diversions of his mind to dictate his creative process. Kurt Seligman, in some ways, worked in this manner in terms of picking up on these elements of looking around for inspiration in his dreams, but also in reality. Whether or not Seligman practiced the same kind of automatistic painting as Dali, we don't know. The offering, if you look at it on the left in our collection, represents two anthropomorphic figures whose bodies seamlessly transform into enigmatic botanical creatures that almost seem to march and move off to the right-hand side of the canvas. And they're set within a surrealist dreamscape. The unusual plant-like forms are also accentuated by the extensive use of green throughout. And you'll see that in the one here in the middle called The Intruder from 1946. They're dressed in very celebratory costume. And Seligman was particularly fascinated by the people who participated in carnival season during the month of March in Switzerland, and the pageantry that surrounded that event in Basel, particularly. So you can see how he was looking at some of the characters who participated in that celebration and ceremony, which in some ways almost takes on religious connotations. Their draperies billowing and windswept as they move through space. So Seligman is an artist who has not received quite enough attention. He was given an exhibition about 4 or 5 years ago at the Stine Gallery in New York City, which is one of the main repositories for his paintings. And here you see on the right a similar work, though not in the green theme, called Sabbath Phantoms, or otherwise known as Mythomania, from about the same time. So I encourage you to explore this fascinating artist's work. When he eventually made it over to America, he would connect with a surrealist group of artists who had been in Paris, who moved to New York City. They included Max Ernst, Marcel Duchamp, a very famous artist, Yves Tanguy, and André Breton, the poet. In their work, these artists and literary figures delved into that world of dreams, exploring the subconscious as the primary means of creative expression. In addition, Seligman was associated with key women surrealists, most notably Kay Sage and Dorothea Tanning, both of whom worked for parts of their careers in Connecticut. And so Seligman went often between New York City and Connecticut, which was the site of second homes of many an American modernists between the 1930s and 40s, all the way up to the present. We move from there and shift gears and look at an entirely different artist by the name of Gerold Sakoto. And Sakoto is another one of these painters who I find particularly fascinating. He was, again, not very well known outside of his native South Africa. He originally studied in Petersburg, South Africa, and he was mentored by an important sculptor there named Ernest Mankoba, who encouraged him to pursue a career as a painter. In 1938, Sakoto would relocate to Johannesburg, where the city's art gallery, in fact, became the first museum in South Africa to purchase a work by a Black artist. And this was really remarkable because at the time, South Africa was under the control of the racist and oppressive apartheid regime. So this must have been really rewarding for Sakoto at the time. His painting Yellow Houses was acquired by that museum in 1940. However, because of conditions in Johannesburg at the time, he went into a self-imposed exile, the artist did, and he eventually would settle down in Paris, beginning in 1947, where he played jazz and published some of his own compositions to supplement his income. Prior to that, he had made very careful drawings of his native South Africa. And during the 50s, he made quite a few paintings in which he looked at daily life of South African people, in this case, going about daily chores, conversing with one another within their villages or city neighborhoods. And he had an exceptional interest in the relationships between mothers and children. And you can see that in these two canvases here, both of which were formerly on the art market, Mealtime and The Visitor, which show an almost South African social realist aesthetic. And that's what he became known for. But our painting in the collection is somewhat different. It brings us even more up close, in some ways up close and personal, to this bond between mother and child that we see in traditional Christian art, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, and particularly in Byzantine icons, as well as early Christian art that's found in Italy. So this painting is another one that really struck me as I was looking for works with untold stories that were really worthy of being exhibited in the museum. I love the warm colors, the oranges, contrasted with the blues in this composition as the woman looks at her child. We can't see the baby's face, but she clutches him close to her. And look at this light. It's almost divine or spiritual. It creates almost a halo above her head. And this quality is something that he tried to focus on in this really beautiful canvas that we have here, called Mother and Child, and made sometime between 1940 and 60. As time went on, Sakoto's work, especially during the 70s, became increasingly political as he responded to the internal resistance movements opposing South Africa's apartheid regime. In addition to Sakoto, we have works by noted American sculptor Malvina Hoffman, the work known as Sicilian Fisherman, a really lovely bronze piece in the field that was created as part of a commission series of 105 works, originally for the Field Museum of Natural History. Hoffman was commissioned to sculpt life-sized bronze sculptures of various human figures that showed diverse races and ethnological types. Now, these were not without controversy in their day because they were included in a Hall of Man exhibition. And in many regards, they stereotype certain ethnic traits of individuals, whether it be the Sicilian fisherman in our collection on the left, or the Samoan warrior on the right in the New Britain Museum of American Art in Connecticut. In order to create the series, Hoffman traveled widely to identify actual models for her sculptures. This one reveals her particular talent for capturing anatomical details, natural gestures, and implying a sense of motion, something that she learned from her teacher, Auguste Rodin, whose work is also represented in the collection. The viewer can imagine the next stage of the fisherman's arrested movement. And we can see that if we zoom in here. He is paused in a moment. He almost seems to be contemplating what his next move is going to be. The cloth is draped across his thigh here, and he holds it across his arm. There's an element of spontaneity, but also incredible attention to detail and a very good understanding of anatomical proportions. Look at also how she looks at his facial expression. And this guy, you could see from this, is very determined and poised to do whatever he's going to do next. Perhaps take his net and throw it into the water, or perhaps he's caught a fish here. It's hard to tell. This one is very different on the right of the Samoan warrior, as he holds what looks like a type of axe in his hand, boldly looks out at the viewer, directly confronting us with that gaze. This being only a half-length bust, whereas this is full length. This one here is about, I'd say about this high. And then over here, this one is about this big. So it's a little bit larger, the Samoan warrior. But imagine these, some of them being life-size. This one that we have in our collection being a bit smaller. Before wrapping up with our presentation, I just want to give a brief overview of a piece by Louise Nevilson that I also featured in a weekend art not too long ago. It's a modestly scaled work displaying this abstract expressionist's approach to constructing multiple layered cut pieces of wood and found objects in something that she termed shadow boxes. Louise Nevilson was among the most important American sculptors of the 20th century. She worked primarily with pieces of wood and found objects, including those of milk boxes and lettuce crates. Nevilson earned her fame for often monumental sculptures. Born into a Jewish family in Tsarist Russia, she emigrated to Rockland, Maine in 1905. And after her marriage, she moved to New York City, where she also studied at the Art Students League and with the famed abstract expressionist painter Hans Hoffman, as well as with an artist named Chaim Gross. She had her first solo exhibition in 1941, but did not achieve widespread success until at least the 1950s. So the work that we have in the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts is from that early stage. Louise Nevilson being among the few women sculptors of the abstract expressionist movement, which is a movement in which artists, it was a movement that was born out of surrealism, in which artists sort of looked back to, in some cases, the world of dreams, but it's really about turning inward into one's own interpersonal world of thoughts. And that's what Nevilson's doing here. She began to focus in the mid-1950s on shallow relief sculptures like the one on the left, ours being quite small compared to Black Wall on the right that's in the Tate collection. And in this, we see her playing around with these forms, manipulating and contrasting different organic elements, some of them with curvilinear shapes, some with them rectilinear, that absorbed or redirect light. And she shows a concern for the emotional value of large three-dimensional assemblage pieces. The one here on the left, to me, appears to be a study, or perhaps that she was intending to incorporate it into a larger composition like you see over here with Black Wall, where you have multiple cells or units that she would stack on top of one another to create a larger composition. You see here that she even incorporated in what look like bedposts, or perhaps lanterns, or at least they're carved in wood to mimic them. They also could be from railings or banisters. And she's pulled all these elements together. Here's something that looks like a pickaxe or a hammer. And then up here we have something that looks almost like an individual modernist sculpture. So Nevilson's work is very interesting. There's not necessarily a particular narrative to the piece. What she's trying to do is she's trying to juxtapose different forms and show how they relate to one another in three-dimensional space. Another artist who worked in this manner is Ralph Bainey, with his piece called The Bride, which is also on view in the gallery. And in the background, you can see the Nevilson, which is quite small, that little shadow box, but still quite powerful. The Bride is quite different from Louise Nevilson's work because it takes on really more of a figural sense, hence the name The Bride, instead of it being purely abstract and about the pairing of different forms. This is an elegant example of Bainey's sculpture, an artist who was originally born in Trinidad and Tobago, but emigrated to the United States. For Bainey, though, he's particularly interested in the curvilinear geometric forms and arranging them in particular ways that reflect light, like Nevilson, but that sort of sway and move. Whereas with Nevilson, you have the shadow box. With Bainey, you were able to walk all the way around the work and see it as a figural representation, though in an abstract manner. Note how the forms essentially bend and curve in space, suggesting movement and activating the work's relationship to their overall surroundings. As the artist remarked, my method of work is to let the wood dictate what direction it should go in. He said also, and I quote, I don't want to try to fight it. I try to get the ultimate in refinement of form and surface quality in order to bring out the inherent beauty of the material. And I think he's really done this here very, very well. He was influenced by English artists because Trinidad's connections to Britain in terms of its colonial past, and influenced by the work of people such as Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, and Robert Clatworthy, who created works like this that have biomorphic, in some cases, figural forms that are blended with abstract shapes. So Bainey was an artist also, I should mention. He was Maryland-based, particularly in his later career, and his wife, Vera, also sculptor, is represented in our collection. So that presents an overview of some of these works in the Kerstein Gallery. And I have decided that I'm going to return to it at a future date, probably in the next, several months. But this is a good stopping point for us today. Next time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about some of the developments in minimalism and also pop art that are represented in the Kerstein Gallery. But between that edition of the Curator's Den and the next one, we are going to focus sooner on the American collections in the museum and explore these, which are on view in the Smith Gallery, and look at Hudson River School paintings, as well as some still lifes and a history painting that's shown there in the center, as well as our Thomas Moran, one of our strongest American paintings in the collection and most beloved works in the museum down below. So thank you very much for joining me in this foray into modernism today, and I look forward to sharing my insights both about the Smith Gallery and the Kerstein Gallery in future editions. Take good care, and I hope that you're having a nice spring.